Okay, so I'm really excited for this panel. It's something that, as people who work in the social impact space, not just civic technology, but in all kinds of areas of social impact, think about on a daily basis, and is one of the hardest nuts to crack. So how do we actually not just measure whether what we're doing is effective, but whether what our goals are the right goals? And especially when we're talking about reforming government or other institutions, which is really generational change, how do we know on a week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis that we're actually making progress towards generational goals? So that's what we're going to talk about here. I'm going to hand it over to Stacy Donohue, who I introduced you guys to earlier, principal at the Omidyar Network, to moderate what will be a really interesting panel. And just a reminder, again, that we want to make this interactive, so raise your hand early and often.
Thanks, Catherine. So Catherine gave us a challenge up front not to make the panel boring, which sets the bar pretty low, but I think we can exceed that expectation and actually make it very interesting and interactive. So what we're going to do is I'll introduce each of the panelists, and each person has a brief set of talking points prepared, some with slides, some going commando, and then after that, I'll kick it off with a few questions just to get the conversation going, while all of you are thinking of your tough stumpers or problems that you're facing to get the panelists' thoughts as well. So we are going to kick it off with Jennifer Pahlka. As many of you know, Jen is the founder and executive director of Code for America. She recently served as the U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and is widely known for her TED Talk called Coding a Better Government. So if you haven't watched it, you definitely should.
Don't read that.
Don't read this?
Don't read that stuff.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to make some stuff up, and that's going to be really fun. Okay, I won't read it, but she has won multiple awards that she doesn't want me to tell you about. And,
I can see what she has been.
But they include the Internet and Society Award from Oxford Internet Institute, a National Democratic Institute Democracy Award, and many others. I got a couple in. She also spent 8 years at CMP Media before founding Code for America, where she led the game group and was responsible for GDC and Game Developer Magazine. She also launched the Independent Games Festival and served as executive director of the International Game Developers Association. So a long history in the gaming world, which I think is really interesting. So I will kick it over to you, Jen.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think Catherine kindly put these slides together. They're actually slides we've been using around the office a lot. And I think the notion here is that to talk a little bit about how we have evolved our thinking about impact. We got to talk a little bit. Does this work? There we go, sorry. About how we frame the work. So, we're 5 years into this, which is sort of amazing. And it's, when we started, we were really just sort of trying to do anything to get this this activity started, and we had a sort of different way of thinking about it. Now we think about it, actually I'm going to go ahead once. This is sort of what we've distilled down to be the core of what we do. You probably all know the mission, the vision statement is the government can work for the people, by the people in the 21st century if we all help make it so. But that's a very high-level statement. What do we actually do? We're documenting the practices of 21st century government. That doesn't mean that we know what they are. We are co-creating them and working with people in government and within civil society and with people to understand what those are. But many of you at the showcase talked about them, particularly in terms of making better decisions with data. We're building and, of course, finding and supporting products and tools that people in government can use that encode those practices. And we're hoping to empower people inside and outside government to implement those practices. So by applying and informing these principles for 21st century government, we're trying to deliver outcomes right now for Code for America in just these 4 focused areas. when we started, you probably all remember that we were doing, have and still do, projects across the board. So transit work, work with schools, work on government websites. What we've realized is that if we're going to get deeper and really show that these principles, when applied, have better outcomes, we have to actually see different results for the American people. And in order to do that, we have to specialize in a couple of areas so that we can build on our own work and also the work of others to really say, it's not just about this idea of getting people excited and showing what's possible when you apply these principles, but actually getting to those outcomes. That takes a long time, and it means you have to build on work year over year. So our focus areas right now are health, which is primarily around access to human services and also some data-driven decision-making in actual health care. Work with the criminal justice system and public safety that's primarily around reducing reliance on local incarceration and working with police departments on better community policing. Economic development work, which is framed around more equitable economic opportunity and bridging the skills gap. And then communications and engagement work, which is about how we publish information to the American public and also how we hear back from communities in a much more representative way. And actually, the publishing information really was initially sparked by a project that Sheba did in Honolulu in 2012. And Catherine has been leading groundbreaking work on the projects that are helping city governments hear from a much wider variety of people on issues of public input. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip from that slide to this one because they say pretty much the same thing. But we have to work on this core of sustainability, obviously, in order to deliver, again, different outcomes in real life situations in these focus areas. FA stands for focus areas here, so that we can change government practices, and we do that so that we can influence the larger ecosystem and have a broader effect. So what this all comes down to is that, again, we're moving from a place of where the metrics that we were following were about things like how many apps were, how people were using the apps, how many apps we were producing, to what are the more sustainable, permanent changes that we can see in the ecosystem, particularly in government, but also, of course, in the community that's changing those practices in government that start to look like longer-term sustainable change. I'm not sure I should go through all of these, but there are things like products that are available to government that encode those practices that we talked about. Governments actually adopting those different products and practices. Of course, we're tracking the number of people in this, what we could broadly call this community, but technologists, people with sort of really basic grounding in the understanding of the digital world who are going into work in government. We can't track all of those, obviously, but we're tracking ones that happen particularly through our network. We're tracking the number of brigade chapters, for instance, and then the pilot scale projects that we think turn into these products that are available for governments. One point that's really important to make is that your metrics evolve over time. We have had the absolute pleasure and I think gift of working with Omidyar on our metrics over the past several years in a way that's deepened our thinking and I think really aligned our team. It's an enormous investment to think about what you're going to track. It's not something that you get in the conference room in the afternoon together and you're like, okay, this is what we're going to track. I mean, it's sometimes taken weeks and months for us to hash out what's really important for us to track. I feel like we never get it 100% right, but the process of talking about it is so incredibly valuable. And then once you've made that upfront investment in figuring out what you're going to track for that year, you've got to come in again next year, and it's never the same. And it's, again, a really important discussion. And you have to invest in the actual tracking of them. So I think that while a lot of us think about metrics as like, okay, we're gonna, open up our Google Analytics dashboard and the numbers will just be there, none of these numbers are actually able to be produced by a computer. These are numbers that, real people are manually putting together by trying to listen to the network, calling various people, figuring out what's going on, and it's a lot of really heavy lift. We have a full-time person at Code for America dedicated to tracking these, but every person on staff has to constantly be aware of, hey, we need to remember that we heard this thing is happening. We need to remember to go, collect the data from this project or that project. And the investment is enormous, but it's definitely worth it. This is just one of the details of, if you click through on our dashboard that I just showed, you'll get for any one of those, you'll get a detailed page like this, where there's just so much going on behind the scenes to put that together. And I will stop there. I'm sorry, I think I went a little long.
So let me introduce for you Eyal. Eyal describes himself as a data junkie who's interested in how data can be personalized, contextualized, and packaged in a format that can help individuals make better decisions to drive social change. He heads up Code for South Africa, a nonprofit civic tech organization that you've heard about already this morning, and is also a founding member of the South African Open Data and Democracy Initiative and coordinator of Hackers Cape Town. He was named in the Media's magazine's 2015 list of the top 40 under 40s who are most influencing media in South Africa. Adi.
All right, hello. We're amongst friends, right? Otherwise, I have to skip quite a few slides. Okay, good. Thankfully, we only have one of our donors in the room, so.
Who's a friend?
Who's a friend? Okay, fantastic. Right, so what I want to speak about, Code for South Africa is very sort of early stage. We are very different to what you mentioned. We're shooting in all directions. We're looking at various areas. We haven't really done a very deep dive, and this is something we're working towards. But I wanted to show some of the projects that we've been working on, and Greg's already spoken about them. But the angle that I'm going to take is why the work that we do sucks. Okay. All right, so the first project that we actually worked on was around the procurement of pharmaceuticals in Southern Africa. So in the SADC region, there are 15 countries, and the ministries of health procure medicines in the public health sector, and of course, we have many health problems in South Africa. It's HIV, TB, malaria, maternal child health, etc. What's crazy, though, is that there is no proper benchmarking of medicine prices. So if you look at this really, really tiny slide, if you compare prices across countries, you see these massive variations. So, for instance, this is ciprofloxacin, which is an antibiotic. And what we did is we collected data from 14 countries. Angola is a really difficult country to get data from. So apart from Angola, we had 14 of the SADC member states. And we collected that information. Sometimes it was a real manual process. I had to twist some techies' arms to get access to their computers and get the data. And if you look at that graph, right at the bottom, you see the bar chart. Those are the prices paid for each country per medicine. And you can see there's a huge difference. I think the middle one, the small one, is Mozambique. They're paying probably a tenth of the price that I think I can't really see. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. There's a huge variation in, is that Angola? All right, well, that really contradicts my previous statement about Angola. But anyway, you can see these massive price differences. Albendazole, which is huge. So South Africa has the largest procurement budget, and you'd expect economies of scale would essentially mean that we pay the least. South Africa's, that bottom graph, pays around 60 times more than Malawi does for albendazole, which is crazy. So we collect all this information. It was actually a long project, so it lasted around 4 or 5 years. And this is a success story. We received an email from the Botswana government saying, for your information, success story from the SARPAM. SARPAM is the name of the project. Price information sharing. We used the 10 Rand tender price in South Africa. So we collected the South African data to push Bayer for a lower price for nifedipine. So nifedipine is an antihypertensive. We are currently paying 99 Rand per pack, which is 10 times as much. This is the same supply, exactly the same box, not any, no, it's not a generic or anything like that. But we've paid as high as 152 Rand in the past. This will amount to saving around 10 million pula per year, which works out to around $2 million US. So this is the presentation we show to the donors. Right, this is that next slide. So, so I was also thinking about another sort of subtitle for this project. I think I'd call it the 1st of January hangover. So the funding lasted until the 31st of December 2014, which is fantastic. Everyone was on board. We saved all this money. The 1st of January, the lights were switched off and they were left off. And that's the reality of these things. Once the funding runs out, do you really have sustainability? Now, it's not that we thought about sustainability at the end of December. We thought about sustainability 18 months beforehand. But we're working with country governments. We're working with the SADC Secretariat, which is sort of the regional oversight body for the various countries. And it's really difficult. Even though you show these great results, it turns out that you need a person whose job it is to care. And a procurement officer's job isn't necessarily to care, it's just to do their job. And so you really need those partners on the ground. So even though I'll show you that we've saved a whole bunch of money, this is, in my opinion, it was nice to show that there's some possibility. It was nice to show that relatively you saved, the return on investment for the donor was huge. But actually, the project is no more, which really sucks. So anyway, did we make an impact? Well, you can see in that email, yes, we did make an impact. Was it sustainable? No way. And the reason why is that the stakeholders didn't really buy into the project. Here's another one, also in the medicine space, so this is in the private sector. The subtitle for this would be, "Don't be so cynical." So in South Africa, medicine prices are regulated. This is in the private sector. So there's a ceiling price that you should, where you shouldn't be paying more for a particular medicine. Then there's a very complicated formula. You have to add taxes, and then there's a dispensing fee for the pharmacist, and it's very complex. And no one really knows about this. So on a plane back from the media party in Argentina, I had the data. I was pretty bored. I had 2 hours on my laptop. I just bought a MacBook Pro because I had like 10 hours. But I had, had a sort of a Linux machine, which was 2.5 hours. So anyway, I was rushing to get this thing done. And what I thought was, you know what? I wanted to build a tool which allowed you to make sure that you weren't being ripped off by your pharmacist, right? That's what I thought. It turns out, well, it doesn't really happen, at least in the pharmacies that I checked. Everyone was charging the maximum amount. People started using it, and what came out of it is that they started looking for generics. So the nice thing about this tool is that when you look across all the medicines, you can see all the medicines with exactly the same ingredients, which means you can now find all the generics. And in this particular example, we're looking at lamotrigine, and the most expensive medicine, or the branded medicine, is 800 Rand. Per month, and the cheapest is 200 Rand per month. So it's a huge price difference for essentially the same medicine, give or take whether you trust the manufacturer or not, which is fantastic. The nice thing about this project, it was super cheap to make, and this for me is a really sort of poignant example. Greg, who's our head of tech, decided we're going to save some money, so we migrated all of our servers somewhere else, and he kind of overlooked migrating this, and it fell over. And so we received an email, "To whom it may concern, it was with sadness that I'm not that your medicine prices registry. Our website is no longer working. The site was a powerful tool in my medical practice. It really helped me to work out treatments that my patients could afford. I'd like to know if the website will be coming back online anytime soon. Thank you very much for your efforts in general." So of course, wow, okay, so we actually have a real user. It wasn't just middle-class people wanting to save a few bucks. It really was, this is change. At least there's one person out there. So I sent him an email saying, "Okay, how did you hear about us? What are you doing with it, etc." So he says, I'm just going to skip some of this, but he works in a mixed income neighborhood, and being able to figure out what works for my patients' budgets is extremely helpful. There's no point in prescribing medicines that the patient cannot afford to pay. Awesome, awesome stuff. So impact, well, maybe. We have one user. We're very proud of that user. So we have changed some people's lives. I'm very happy about that. Is it sustainable? It's actually super easy to run this thing, right? So we just scrape the data from the website every so often. We update the data, and we're really bad at marketing. We've never marketed this thing at all, and we have users streaming in. We have the same people coming in. It's not just that one doctor. It turns out there are a couple of doctors. Well, we assume people who look at this thing every day. So fantastic. Have we been successful? I'm not sure. Have we changed the world? I don't know, but it was a relatively cheap experiment, so that's okay. Although we really do need to push it. The subtitle for this project, I would say, would be, you're not really that important in the greater scheme of things. So this is a project that Greg mentioned, Black Sash, monitoring social grants, pensions, child support grants, etc. And what we did is we used, there's cell phones where we collected information on service delivery, etc., and created these posters. The nice thing about posters is it's one of the best technologies available. It doesn't need battery power, it doesn't need reception, you can drop it and it doesn't break, it's pretty cheap. It's an old technology, it's pretty robust. And if you look at that picture, this is where they were used. They really were used prompts for discussions, which I thought was really cool. So let's take ourselves out from the middle of the story, right? So we're not building apps and we're not changing the world. We're helping in an organization and people to do what they should be doing. One of the things that bothers me about the tech scene, not civic tech, but technologists in general, they always use the word solve. Let's solve this problem, we'll do this. I think it's a real problem. We don't solve problems. We're actually not that important in the greater scheme of things. It's those people who are actually on the ground. They're important, and what we should be doing is we should be helping and trying to solve those little problems that sort of that facilitate this sort of discussion. So we're actually very proud of this because we actually didn't do very much. So impact. The way we define impact is not whether we've changed lives, it's whether we've helped organizations like Black Sash do their work better. And that's one of the things we're playing around with. So I think we made some impact here, I'm not sure, but certainly their organization is changing their entire business model to use this type of approach. So we're quite happy with that. Sustainable. Actually, this is social auditing. I don't know if it happens in other places around the world. I know India, but I don't know other countries. And the nice thing about it is the plan is to get government to pay for auditing of what happens at the grassroots, but to some extent be independent. So organizations like Black Sash could wave a stick and say, well, have a look at this. You guys aren't doing a great job. Overall success, yes, I've already mentioned that. Living wage, we've spoken about it. Subtitle for this project would be, you can't do it alone. All right, so as Greg mentioned, we had quite a few hits. We had some really interesting conversations. As Greg mentioned, with YouTube, the conventional wisdom is do not read the comments. That's just do not read the comments. News 24, which is, we published it here, it's the same thing. You do not read the comments, and that's what we did. We actually literally down. What was great, though, was just looking at the discussions, being part of them, and many people, so anecdotally, people said, well, we didn't realize that we were paying too little. I'm not going to go into the context of why domestic workers are a real issue in South Africa in terms of inequality, but many people, it's not that they were trying to exploit their workers, it was just they had no idea that poor people really struggle, just like middle-class people in terms of expenses. So the reason why I call it Do Not Do It Alone is, well, we're just a civic tech organization. Who are we to change policy or to run with this? Flash in the pan, this project was really successful for a week. We had lots of discussion. Anecdotally, some people, people said, well, they've changed. They actually have raised salaries, which is great. But what you need is a sustained campaign, and what you need is a partner on the ground who runs with it. And so, while again, from a donor perspective, that's fantastic. This is amazing. It's a really cool story. it doesn't work if you don't think it through. And we realized this. We actually went on a roadshow looking for partners, and it seemed that no one was interested in that particular aspect of domestic worker salaries. So we did it because it was a good idea. No one wanted to pick it up, and hopefully something will come out of it. But this isn't good enough. Okay, so is it measurable? I have no idea. This is one of the questions I'd really like to throw to the floor at some point, is how do we really measure, have salaries increased? Are people paying better salaries? I don't know. So that's really a big question that I'd like to get some insight into. Sustainable, possibly. What we'd really like to do is put it on the Department of Labor's website. So when people search for how much should I pay my domestic worker, it doesn't go to that terrible site which recommends that you should pay 2,000 Rand basic, but you can pay 2.5 if she knows how to cook, and 3 if she knows how to drive. I mean, those are ridiculous. That's one of the first hits that you get. We want to go into the Department of Labor's website, where actually when people look for contracts, etc., they have this tool. In terms of success, from a media perspective, it was great. I think it was quite innovative in some ways. So we also work in the media space, so that was great. Social change, as I mentioned, we probably didn't make a long-term change. I have lots of other examples of what I call complete failures. It's actually not that bad. I think it's really important to really look at your work critically and not just pat yourself on the back and say, we're awesome. And that's one of the things that we try to do as much as possible internally. Yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks, Adi. All right, next up we have Matthew McNaughton, who you heard from this morning. Matthew is the executive director of the /Roots Foundation, a civic tech nonprofit building digital tools and services to transform the relationship between governments and citizens in the Caribbean. In this role, he develops strategies and leads projects to improve the design and delivery of public services and development programs. He focuses on the process by which institutions become more data-driven, utilizing open data, user-centered design, and beneficiary feedback loops. Matthew.
Good morning again, everyone. I'll try to be quick because I do want a number of questions have been thrown out. Similarly to what Adi said, our organization, /Roots, is also still quite young, relatively speaking. Quite a small team of awesome people who are watching the live stream, so hello everyone. It's we've almost taken a different approach, kind of what's in that we really started and just focused in really deep on a particular sector, which just has its downfalls, similarly to kind of going wide and then you kind of become agriculture guys. But it's been interesting in that it's been such a critical sector for Jamaica. And what I would just like to kind of contribute as a framing is kind of what the pushback has been for us in terms of the challenge. And to best articulate that, I really wanted to start with maybe just quickly talking about the context, and then we can maybe just jump right into the conversation after the next person speaks. So if you've maybe seen me present, some of you may be familiar with this visualization, which is effectively of the Jamaican budget a couple years ago, 2012, 2013. The long and short of it is really that big red box that you see there on the left is debt servicing. So Jamaica is actually one of the most indebted countries in the world. We've about 140% debt to GDP ratio. And what that really equates to in our context is that for every dollar that the Jamaican government has, 55 cents of that goes to paying back debt interest, right? And then after that 55 cents, about 25 cents goes to wages and salaries for the public sector. So really what you're left with is 20 cents to run the entire investments in infrastructure, roads, schools, you name it, like services. So we're a country running on 20 cents per dollar, which is crazy, and it's funny. I mean, most people are probably more familiar with like the Greece thing. So we actually also have the most austere budget in the world, which is quite interesting. Greece, which most people are kind of more familiar with, is threatened to leave the euro because they were saying that they should pay about a 3% primary surplus, which is really like what your budget is before you start, like what your cost revenue is before you start paying interest. So they were going to say like 3% is ridiculous, and it was supposed to be like 4% this year, 3% next year. Jamaica is up at 7.5%, right? So it's crazy. I mean, but what I will also say within that context is that I'm also quite optimistic about our government, because I think in the kind of broader scheme of the IMF program, which oftentimes people talk about IMF as a really awful institution, the program that they've been on and have implemented over the last 3 to 5 years has actually facilitated a number of the structural reform that we've needed as a country, and that otherwise politically was suicide, and that a number of governments have not had kind of the wherewithal or just kind of the strength of will to implement those things. And so our debt to GDP ratio is trending downwards. Our macro figures are good. Interest rates are the lowest that they've been for quite some time. We're growing 2 years in a row. And so things are actually moving in the right direction. But I start with that context is that because it's important to understand that for us, particularly when we've been talking to government, because we work quite closely with the agencies in the Caribbean, is that the app was never sexy. You know, like when you're within the context of some of these structural changes and the challenges, being able to talk about building an app was never enough for what we're like. We need to do that. Well, what is the context of this within the challenges that exist within the sector? And you know, in whether it's, you know, some people make fun of when you talk about predial larceny, which in the U.S. context is like cattle wrangling. It's a $5 billion problem in Jamaica for the agricultural sector. And so when we started, our fellowship was focused around that program. The question was like, well, what does this mean for how we're addressing this problem? And so the challenge of that, the difficulty of that challenge back to you is that, well, how do you measure your impact against something as grand and big as that? And if, you know, if many of us in this room are in the game of development, like development is a very complex system. You can optimize one part of the engine or one part of the system, not have a very big impact on the larger scheme of things, but that small optimization is still important. No one really knows like at what point does the needle change and then everything starts moving in that right direction. And so within that context, we've had to figure out, particularly with our partners, like how do we measure progress, how do we measure success, how do we measure impact? And so just to kind of quickly add what we've kind of approached to doing, and this is something that we're still kind of working through, is on kind of 3 different levels. I think at the high level, we're looking at talking about things that are like, all right, well, almost like high-level political structure. So particularly at the highest level of government or the agencies, how are we, the persons who kind of lead those organizations or lead those agencies, like how are they thinking about some of these problems? What's the language that they're using? The International Open Data Conference happened this year, and I was really proud to see that the Caribbean had a very large contingent there. We're now working on a government-wide open data policy. We've a new CIO who's pretty plugged in, and we've been able to have conversations with those persons around a number of these things, and they're looking at that. The second is on the institutional level, both across institutions or within a singular institution. Earlier I mentioned the MOU, so there's no broad open data policy, so there's not really either a posture or a history of cross-agency or collaboration, particularly around data, because data is seen as power. So if like I have the data, then like I'm now like the big man. But we've been working with these 2 organizations, and they've just drafted a data sharing MOU to share information across the agencies, and now looking at talking about things around standards and just improving the quality of information in a sector which traditionally is either not sexy or not seen as where technology really fits in. And then the last one, which is, both of those are really process type, like milestones. I think the one which we're really interested into getting into is our own service delivery indicators. And so now we're looking at, all right, well, how do you transition from thinking of, well, the services that we're designing, what does this mean in terms of measuring, like, what's the impact or what's the quality of care or the quality of service that's being delivered by these agencies, and integrating that into the way that services are both designed and delivered. And one of the projects that we're working on now around just farmers' access to information and access to markets, where we've been talking to the agency around getting those things measured as part of the service delivery process, which we're also really excited about. And so it's been an interesting process because, as my last 2 points in that, and I think Jen said this a while ago, is the process by which any agency, much less government, becomes data-driven is a non-trivial one. It's hard for any organization to do it, much less a large bureaucracy where inertia is just the general flavor of the day. But what we found is that even at a peripheral level, as data usage or information exists or measuring happens, the appetite for data also increases. And so it's very much an iterative process where we've looked at different parts of that complex system, started to try to incorporate information into some of those things, and have now kind of, hopefully, iterating upwards and onwards. So I'll stop there, but that's our experience so far.
Finally, I would like to introduce Laura Walker-MacDonald. As the CEO of the Social Impact Lab Foundation, Laura supports organizations around the world to use mobile technology to transform their work. Drawing on her expertise in humanitarian aid, human rights law, and international development, she brings a cross-disciplinary approach to communications, innovation, and information management. Laura writes and speaks about SIMLab's work and mobile for social change more generally, with a particular focus on humanitarian aid and quality and accountability. Before coming to SIMLab, Laura worked for the British Red Cross on international humanitarian policy and learning, focused on quality and accountability, innovation, urbanization, cash transfer programming, and civil-military relations, as well as strategic planning. And she's going to answer all our questions about how to measure and evaluate our progress.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. You still with us? Yes. Hello. I'm British, I'm sorry. That's what I have to say in America, right? Anyway, so I don't have slides, and I don't have any necessarily answers, but I do have a story, because we're among friends, so I can tell you the story of what we've been working on and how that's gone. And so I'm going to try and do that. And I'm going to try and stick to my notes for a change, because I have so many feels about everything that you guys have been saying. It all sounds so familiar. And it's also, I just want to say, it's such a pleasure to be here again. I was here in Berlin with you guys last year, and it's lovely to see so many familiar faces. And also, you meet cool people around, and then you come to a Code 4 event, and there they all are. So it's nice to see friends in the audience. So SIMLab, we help people create social change with technology. That's it. We try to err on the side of inclusive tech, so low tech, no drones. We tend to be more on the SMS side of things, text messaging. And for 10 years, nearly 10 years on the 5th of October, we made Frontline SMS. I don't know if any of you have heard of Frontline SMS. It gets used a lot in development, international development circles, because it's a really easy way to stand up a text messaging service really fast. You usually have to go around the network operators if you want to do anything fast. And so you just use a phone and a computer, and away you go. Check it out. They have APIs now. It's so exciting. And I say they because we spun them out at the end of last year. So we're a foundation, a nonprofit, and they're now a for-profit. So there's a long, complicated tale behind that, which I will need to be in a bar to really share. But we did, as part of sort of looking at this, we did try very hard to measure the impact that we were having as a platform provider. We were always generic. We never specialized. We refused to specialize. Nobody likes that. So we insisted that we were building an app that was just a really good app, and you could use it in whatever social change work you wanted, be it agriculture or health or election monitoring or whatever it was. So we were then in the position of building an app that was used it's been downloaded in over 200 countries, over 200,000 times the last time I had checked, which is a little while ago. And so we had a lot of potential users out there. But I want to take a second just to say why you want to know how it's going, what you're trying to check. And I think it's it's really important to understand how you suck, like the ways in which what you're doing sucks. Then you need to understand why, and then you need to try not to do that again, at least not deliberately. So it's not just about knowing what your impact was and what happened because I was here and I did this work, but it's also, there's a real-time element to this where you have to check in, you have to do A/B testing, you have to do monitoring, and you have to find out how it's going and then tweak. But also at key points through whatever you're doing, you should check in and say, okay, what are the big level lessons here? And then you get to impact, to the kind of, okay, but what really happened because we were here? So, okay, great, so we're on board. I came from an institutional background. I knew all about program cycles and things like that, and I knew that I was supposed to have a log frame. And so I sort of sat down to try and get from the very nice blog posts that we had telling all the stories about our users to actually the numbers behind the stories, and it was really hard. And partly, I think, because we didn't really know, it was hard to tell how we should be measured, how our work should be measured. And this gets a little bit to business model, as many things ultimately do. What really dictates what you measure is where the money comes from and why, and what that person's definition of value is, because that should be your definition of value. And so because we were in the international development space, we were being funded by people who were interested in international development or in governance and civic tech and things like that, and their interests were around social impact. So we were being evaluated for the longest time and continually, and we continue to look at ourselves this way, as a platform provider that was trying to achieve social change. So we were being evaluated like a development agency, which is really hard because actually we were making software. And so we weren't implementing, our users were implementing. We didn't have control over their M&E, their own monitoring and evaluation. So that was really tough. But then, so we actually, SIMLab now is continuing to implement with partners, but we help them to do better monitoring and evaluation of their impact using technology. So we try and tease out what's the contribution that technology has made to your election monitoring or your ARV retention project. And we're looking at some very nerdy ways of doing that, like drawing on the OECD DAC criteria. Oh, yes. See, nobody gets that. There are no development nerds in this room. So depressing. Anyway. Yeah. All that training was really useful, yeah. Anyway, it's cool because it basically boils down to two things. How did the rollout go, and were you doing the right thing in the first place? That's really what they mean. They use words like relevance and effectiveness and efficiency and sustainability, but we all know that if you don't do something efficiently, you waste money. If it's not sustainable, it goes away, and that's sad. If it's not relevant, you're doing the wrong thing. So we're looking at those kinds of things. But actually, and this happened to me last week, I had a conversation with a donor, and she said, I think we might have got this a little bit wrong, because I think if you're a software development company, then maybe we should be evaluating you like you're a software development company. And I thought, oh yeah. I've been here 5 years. I thought, oh, right, okay, right, so what would that look like? Well, I mean, that's just how, that gets back to the definition of value, because if you're a for-profit, you have this very clear definition of value that you and your investors like collude in, right? If you're a social impact firm, then you have a triple bottom line, so you have other things. You do still have to do this touchy-feely social impact indicator business, but you also can say, are we providing a good piece of software? Does it work most of the time? Is it changing? Is it keeping up with new frameworks as they come out? Are we providing decent customer support? Is it likely to still be here next year? Is it available on all platforms? Is it easy to localize? Can you translate it? That is really hard and really important to think about up front. So the answer is I don't know. And having been here for 5 years and Frontline's 10, and we're just figuring this out now, I'm like, I wish I'd thought of this earlier. But I think what it does come back to is know why you're doing what you're doing and what that definition of value is, and evaluate. I would encourage, like, especially if you are providing platform or if you're providing people who provide a platform, or know what your theory of change is, and then that's what you should evaluate and manage and do all the work of collecting all the indicators, which is really, really hard. Yeah, so I think know thyself. And I'm going to go away and do some hard thinking myself, I think. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was really helpful to get us started and deeply into the topic. One thing I just wanted to add from a donor's perspective, because that that notion has come up quite a bit in people's comments is, at least at Omidyar Network, we're actually going through the exact same difficult process that all of you are going through. You know, we have a board who's asking us, what is your social impact and how do you measure it? And so, you know, I just want to maybe disabuse us of the notion that kind of donors are on one side and operators are on the other. Ultimately, we're all trying to figure out how to measure the impact of what we're doing collectively here. And it's pretty similar in some ways, Adi, to what you described about you're trying to help other organizations do their work better. But how do you know what the end impact is? I feel your pain on that because we're actually trying to figure out that exact same thing. And Jen and I have also been working through that right now. So I hope to get a lot out of this conversation as well to figure out how to measure that from a donor's perspective. So Catherine let me know that we are a little bit squeezed for time, so we're going to go directly to the audience for questions, and we have roving microphones.
Yes, I can bring the microphone to you. So we're here, and then go over here. Pass that over, please. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Becky. I work at the UN on an innovation initiative, and my question's for Matthew. I just wanted to know if you can talk a little bit more about the MOU process and how you got people to that point.
It's interesting. I mean, and I know we're not long on time, so maybe we can also talk afterwards. I would say the key thing here, I think, for us was just understanding like, what is the language that government uses itself to figure out how they work together. Like I think before we started working in agriculture space, the notion of an MOU didn't really mean a lot to us. It's like, all right, well, if we agree that we're going to work together, then we should work together. You know, like, why does it need to be formalized in this like poorly worded document that has all of this legal preamble and that actually doesn't really get to what we're saying? And then half the time when we're signing it publicly, it's a blank piece of paper that we're signing. And so actually what ended up happening to that is that really it was the heads, we got the buy-in at the technical level from the persons on both sides, and they kind of spoke up to their agents to say, well, to get that buy-in. And I think once they kind of said, all right, well, we're going to do this, the natural step for them, if what that meant was, all right, well, we're going to sign an MOU as an agency to work. Jamaica, even though we're very laid-back people, we can also be pretty inflexible in some of these things. And we found that, you know, even though we had been working with some of these partners for a while, like the next logical step, especially when it got to some of the integration stuff, is just like, we need the MOU, as if that was going to protect us from anything else that was going to happen. So it took a really long time to get the first draft of it because we didn't want to take responsibility for the first draft of the document. And by a long time, like 3 months. And so we got a draft of it about 2 weeks ago. We took a look at it and it was not anywhere near where it needed to be. And so we kind of revised it and in terms of as ghostwriters. And so it's now been sent over for like review and approval. And so hopefully that should be finalized soon.
Hi. I have a question for Stacy, actually. So from a funder's perspective, a donor's perspective, how acceptable is it to have to be reporting on a huge variety of metrics as opposed to like 3? Because in my experience, you can't really box things into 3 metrics most of the time. You can box them into like 500. So if people were to come to you and say, hey, I have 30 projects and 500 metrics, is that an okay thing to do? And would you all take the time to sift through that and judge accordingly? Or do you really just need 3 and we should try to figure something out?
So my reaction to that would be that if you've got 30 projects and 500 metrics, you're probably spreading yourself too thin. And so it's not about number of metrics that we would want to review or not. It would be about prioritization and thinking, it doesn't have to be 3 things, even though everything's always conveniently in 3s. But it is about focus when you've got limited resources, and burnout is also a huge issue in the space. So I would recommend thinking about how to winnow that down to a more manageable number of priorities, or figuring out how to kind of sequence the different projects over time.
Well, let's pretend I'm focused. Let's pretend I only have 3 projects tonight, right? Is that acceptable? Let's pretend.
Is it acceptable for?
I'm not asking for money right now.
Good to know.
And recording what you say, we're holding it.
Do you really need a few metrics and that's it? And like really give me those 3 over your 3 projects? Or?
Yeah, so the metrics that we review for understanding progress and also for making disbursements, because we do tie the grant structure to metrics, we tend to try to simplify to kind of 3 to 5 to like what are the big indicators that help us all know that things are heading in the right direction. That could be different though from kind of your key performance indicators that you as an organization are using to run yourselves. And I think Jen had a great example of, they've got really detailed metrics or sub-metrics for each of the kind of 6 areas that they're tracking. And you know, do I dig deep into the 30 sub-indicators of each of the 6 metrics? No. For me to know where the 6 are headed is great, but I think for you and your organization, you need that level of detail.
Yeah, maybe I can, you know, don't confuse organizational metrics with the sum total of things you measure, because you're always going to measure a whole ton of things. From the top level of the organization, you need to have a reasonable number of things that you're tracking, but you won't know you're headed there without a whole bunch of other things that you're measuring underneath. But you make those, I mean, and I'm going to make it sound like we've got this all nailed. We're still struggling with it in many, many ways, but let me give you an example. We're doing this awards program for technologies at the summit this year. We'll, you know, some of you probably have applied. Thank you very much. But the idea really is it's got to be connected to your theory of change. So one of the pieces of our theory of change is that the government contracting ecosystem is going to have to change, and we want to shine the spotlight on companies and tools that are consistent with the 21st century principles. Well, I can't even remember at this point what the top level metrics are. But if you are going to get to that outcome of having, you know, of giving awards to some great companies and tools and products and projects, you're going to have to track things like who's looking at the website, like are people actually coming to this, are people applying, like all of these things along the way that aren't going to show up in your overall metrics of your org, but the person running that program on a day-to-day basis better be looking at a large set of numbers to know if we're headed in the right direction because of all the work that goes into it.
Just a quick kind of a counterpoint, and I know there are different schools of thoughts on this, and I don't think there's anything right or wrong. I think the other side of it is that oftentimes when you're measuring stuff, especially in programming, and I know Laura probably can talk about this, especially is that there's this perverse incentive to measure a lot of different things. And especially sometimes if you're looking at our particular resource constrained environment, that's not feasible. And so I can talk about one example that comes to mind. It's a case study and a friend from that was from the UN, but this is a UNICEF project in Nigeria with the Nigeria population control, and they identified one key metric to record across all of their birth facilities every 2 weeks, and that was the number of boys registered and the number of girls registered. And just by getting that one metric at a significant majority of their facilities across the country, they were able to tell a lot about the health of what was going on. I mean, they cross-reference it with other types of information around census, but just even the investment to get that one metric on a national scale across all of those facilities was significant. And if they had maybe started, you know, that the kind of lesson learned with that was like, sometimes it's better to scale vertically than horizontally, like get that one metric right, get it at a data point that you can trust and focus on that. And then once you've kind of addressed that, then you can start to look at other things. But there are probably so many questions that you have just from looking at that one core metric to that particular program that you might be able to look at a number of different things as well. So.
Hey guys, I'm Julia. I'm doing everything international at the Sunlight Foundation, and I know a lot of you. And first of all, thanks for this really honest, upfront, and blunt panel. It was really helpful. one quick comment and then a question to, I guess, all of you guys. I've been pretty obsessed with impact in the last few months, and to be honest, the more I dig into metrics and assessing impact, the more confused I get. And one thing that I saw in a lot of contexts is that there's a huge problem with attribution. How much of the actual long-term social change can be attributed to our organization? Like I know that a lot of people work on amazing projects, and at the same time there is change in the regional or local context. But how much of that change can be attributed to that work? Who knows? So I was wondering whether you guys, in your own context, and whether you, Stacy, or any of the other funders, Daniela, were thinking of trying to combine the efforts of different local groups and advocates and civic hackers and try to measure the change in a context together? Or is that something that we should think about at all? Because to me it seems like measuring, and again, like this is turning into a comment, sorry, but to me it seems like trying to measure the impact alone as organizations might not be the best way to go forward. So this is a comment and a question to all of you.
I think the answer is yes, take credit for it. Every time, yes, take credit for it.
T-shirts. So I don't have a T-shirt yet. I need a SIMLab T-shirt. It's normal to be confused. I get more confused the more I think about it every time. And when I don't look at it for a while, I think this is very straightforward, and then I get back into it. Anyway, I mean, there is a technical answer to that question, which is that, like, I mentioned logical frameworks earlier. They are a misnomer. They're not a framework and they are illogical. But they do have like some kind of sense. So you go from the goal level, which is I want to decrease under 5 mortality in this place, whatever. And then you have your outcome level. And at that level and down, you should be able to attribute the thing you're trying to measure to your work. And so that's the technical answer. The outputs should definitely be you. And the activities should definitely be you. The outcome, there should be some kind of line. But then you should not be able to necessarily point to the change at the goal level being you, because it could be a lot of things. And so it's kind of one of those intellectual sleight of hands that M&E monitoring evaluation people do, where you think, oh, so you are cheating. But they are, and that's fine, apparently. So, I mean, that's the technical answer. But I think that you just mentioned something really interesting, which is I would also love to see more of us come together and do joint evaluations or joint work to look at our impact as groups of people working on similar issues in a similar place. I think that we can only learn more by doing that, and or by taking like different learning evaluations and different processes that people have done and putting them together and trying to draw out more from them. And one of the big challenges there is actually being able to share and learn openly. And I think, and being open about risk, which is really hard in development. I think that the technology space is way better at that than the traditional sort of social change and development spaces. And so the closer you get to that world, the more those are your partners, and maybe your money is coming from some of those institutions, the harder it is. But I think it's really important to stick to our open, let's have a stand up and say what we messed up today kind of approach from the tech side. I think that's really important.
Anyone else like to comment?
I think I'm probably going to echo what most people think, is that the world is a complex place. And as Catherine says, take credit. Of course you're going to take credit, but you probably haven't had that much impact anyway. But I don't think it's our job to measure the impact. It's very difficult. I think it's possibly maybe something that researchers, academics should be doing, and look at if there's some sort of causal relationship between outcomes and impact. So what we can do is we can measure outcomes. I mean, even your indicators, they all seem to be outcome-based, not impact-based, because people have done this. Well, we've been involved in the activities, and these are our outputs, and this is what's happened as a result. Is there a causal relationship between those outcomes and the impacts? And if there is, and if that's something that I suppose we should actually have a proper academic study to find out, otherwise we're just making things up. I think that means we can maximize our outcomes. We can measure that relatively easy. It's still difficult, but it's possible. And not worry too much about the impact. That's just a thought, but I think it seems like a practical way forward.
My two brief reactions to that would be, I think about the work that our team, our health team is doing to increase access to food stamps. And it's so, by its nature, collaborative. They cannot get what they need done if they're not working with government entities, nonprofits, people on the street. There's just this wide range of people who are involved with it on a daily basis. And thank God for Slack, because they can all just be in the Slack channel together talking. It's by definition collaborative work. You cannot get to the result if there's not a bunch of people on board. And I think that in some ways, though, we have to take credit, like when we're presenting to the Omidyar Investment Committee, like we have to take credit. But there's a natural tension between taking credit and sustainability, in the sense that if our goal is to get to our vision by influencing governments, communities, and the company ecosystem, the more that governments, communities, and companies in the government ecosystem think that change is theirs, not ours, the more sustainable it is. If we end a project with a government project, a partner, and we're like, well, hey, we did great work, we have failed, right? The government partner has to say, we in government are doing something differently, and we're part of it, and it's ours. And that's, in some measure, that is our goal. So in some ways, we kind of want to not take credit.
And from a funder's perspective, we spend a lot of time thinking about this attribution versus contribution issue, and have kind of created a framework for ourselves to articulate our theory of change and the outcome that we're seeking, and then the steps along the way that we think let us know whether or not we're contributing to that right direction. And some things are measurements that we have direct ability to influence, and some things aren't. But we've, over time, sort of gotten comfortable with the notion that not everything has to be attributable, but there does need to be a contribution. And we look a lot at the influence that, for example, the organizations that we're funding are having on the overall ecosystem. And one example would be Code for America. In addition to impacting individuals across cities in the U.S. and abroad, was the inspiration for the Presidential Innovation Fellowship at the White House. And Todd Park says that to everyone who will listen, and says it over and over again, that what Jen and the team did there inspired the U.S. government to do essentially the same thing. That's a huge contribution to the movement, and Code for America should definitely be taking credit for that. And it's also great that Todd and the White House give credit where credit is due. So those are the types of examples of kind of indirect influence that I think are really important, that all of us in the room should be thinking about as we collectively build the ecosystem.
So Stacy, we've got one here, and then over to Eyal.
Okay. Speak, whoever's speaking. Oh, Alex.
All right. So as I have a mic, I would like to basically ask the question about not rather defining the impact, but about scaling the impact up. So there are two examples, basically. One of them, as I'm from Ukraine, we have started a great discussion with CIO of Jamaica a couple of months ago about the agriculture, which led to the virtual introduction to Matthew. And it seems like Jamaica promised to basically help Ukraine with the open code of the agriculture app, basically based on an agreement that we will translate the interface and basically use the same data sets about agriculture, but in Ukraine. And at the same time, Ukraine was asked by Moldova, which is a neighbor country, to do very similar stuff about management of infrastructure and management of public transportation. I mean, that they will translate the interface and basically